Hello all, I'm working on a history of Los Angeles from its geological formation to the first inhabitants and more of its early history that usually gets breezed over in history class, even in the schools here. But today I also wanted to start another small series on the Vikings. And while this history has been covered in great detail by several channels, movies, video games, etc., I would like to take a different look at them. Rather than point out how accurate or inaccurate the new Assassin's Creed game is going to be, or even if it's going to be about assassins, let's take a look at the world of the Viking Age. Not just the conquests, but their actual need for exploration, expansion, and trade. Like other famous warriors and soldiers from history, they have been romanticized and mythologized so much, and at times we only focus on their fierce reputation for raids and violence. But the Scandinavian people participated in much larger world events. Structures of trade, stretching across Europe and even going to Baghdad, which is in present-day Iraq, and exploring parts of the so-called New World and making a truly first contact between indigenous American peoples and white Europeans. And before we go any further, this video is sponsored by No One. No One provides a simple and easy way for you to find copyright-free pictures and detailed script writing for YouTube videos. If you would like to help the channel, like No One has, please subscribe, check out my Patreon page, and download the Brave browser for more private internet and more history videos. If you're wondering just how the Vikings randomly show up out of nowhere in history at a specific year and terrorize an unprepared Europe, you're not alone. But this may not be the whole truth. We have to ask, were there Vikings before the Viking Age, which is commonly held to be between 793 and 1066 CE? Well, historians don't really use the term Viking outside the period, and I don't think we should have referred to all Scandinavian peoples as Vikings. Or maybe they do want that. I don't know. I'm still waiting for the call back from the embassies on that one. But there are probable encounters in recorded history where Scandinavian peoples might have taken part in before the 9th century. And just to clarify, when I refer to Scandinavia, we are talking about the areas that comprise modern-day Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. And I'm not going to get into the difference between Nordic countries and Scandinavian because it gets way too complex for this video. But you guys can duke it out in the comments section if you like. I'll leave a link to an article. But while not specifically pointed out by peoples, such as the ancient Romans, they most definitely encountered one another. Now, the Romans weren't marching directly into the heart of the Fennoscandia Peninsula, but Roman trade goods did. This indicates merchants either traded indirectly with intermediaries or directly at border towns in Germania, the northern Gallic coastline, and Roman Britain as well. Most likely, both forms of trade went on, along with the exchange of news and culture. As for raids, probably the most famous in Roman Britain and post-Roman Britain would be the Saxons. And while the Saxons were originally from the northern regions of what's today Germany, they were by no means the only raiders. Romans and Britons perhaps weren't too exact on distinguishing everyone by group. Like the Greeks, if you weren't part of the main culture, you usually got labeled as a barbarian, whether it be Saxon, Celt, Pict, or something else, with little regard to how accurate they were being. It's like the European settlers in the Americas just referring to all indigenous peoples as Indians. Some may have known which tribe they were dealing with by the markings and clothes, but if you were seeing members of different tribes and had no previous experiences with them, you might just think they are all part of the same group. So while tradesmen and perhaps some soldiers and diplomats might have known who was a Saxon and who was an Anglo, Irish, Dane, or Jute, probably a majority of the population just referred to everyone raiding them as Saxons or whichever group the village thought was attacking them at the moment. I'll just say this. It's ironic that the Anglo-Saxons who started out raiding the place and eventually taken over would get raided themselves by similar peoples, and, after defending against them, would get taken over by the descendants of those same peoples. More on that in future episodes. While this, and future raids and trading for that matter, were not as clear as we would like, Scandinavians did not live in a bubble. They must have had regular contact and news from other parts of Europe to make informed decisions on where to raid, what would be of value, and more. So it is possible Scandinavian peoples and their leaders had taken part in, or at least had knowledge of, these events before the Viking Age. The term Viking itself comes from this time period, which roughly translates into explorer really, and can include pirating and raiding, but from what I can find, it is not restricted to only those occurrences. There are surprisingly a lot of reasons that historians, archaeologists and others state for the cause of the Viking Age. For today, let's focus on the most popular and well-known of those reasons: population. This model was brought forth as one of the earliest reasons as to why the Vikings began raiding late in the 8th century. With farms and produce only able to feed and house so many, there were a great deal of people who were left without homes, status, or means of survival, which encouraged raiding. But there is an issue with the population reasoning. When first put forth, it was used to claim the Vikings only began raiding to settle new regions and to gain land. While this eventually would be the case, it seems it was not the primary motivation for the early years of the age. In fact, evidence shows population rise wouldn't occur on a grand scale until several years into the 9th century. Most raids were conducted by young men with no families brought along to settle. No deal or claim was even made for the land, just the goods taken. So at first, the raids weren't necessarily taken to gain new territory, but that doesn't mean we should ignore the population factor. While it is almost too simple an answer and doesn't take into account other events, it could at least be a partial explanation for the raids. But what would have led to a population boom? Well, changing climate factors could be used to help clarify. When looking at European climate history, you'll see that there are several warming and cooling periods, which of course affected agriculture, settlements, and population. Many have heard of the medieval warming period, but of course that means the period before was not as warm. For a period of roughly 500 years, between 400 and 900 CE, the climate of the North Atlantic began trending toward a cooler, wetter place. The harshest years in Scandinavia would come in the mid-500s, but that would be the climactic point of this particular period, and while spotty across Europe, things began to slowly warm up afterward. The medieval warming period is regarded as officially beginning around the year 900, but that would indicate that conditions had been changing for a while before. Most likely, around the 800s, the climate began to go into an intermediate zone between the harsh, cold years before and the warmer centuries ahead. Temperature didn't change too much, with very gradual lengthening of seasons and warmer temperatures over the decades, but things weren't getting colder, and that was beneficial. While not as warm as it would be, summers and springs were lasting a bit longer in this intermediate period, not only allowing for marginally longer growing seasons, but more usable land to farm. This is important to note, as harsh environmental conditions ultimately control how large a population can effectively become and still be able to survive. Too big a population meant you wouldn't have enough to eat because food production was hampered by the bitter climate. This most definitely affected the peoples of Scandinavia, as well as village populations around Northern Europe. But the slight warming meant that some soils would no longer become frozen and could be used for farming. As inhabitable territory expanded and farms grew, the food supply increased, meaning that now parents could have a few extra kids without worrying about survival. When those kids grew up, they needed their own farms and had kids themselves. But a scarcely warming climate doesn't mean Scandinavia became a tropical and agricultural paradise. Available land only expanded so much. Winters were still long and very cold. Growing seasons, while a tad bit longer, weren't long enough to support a slowly expanding population. Within a generation or two, in many places across Scandinavia, the available land limit was reached, and while things weren't necessarily crowded up north yet, the population was growing. Younger peoples, especially the men, found themselves with less land to work. Obviously, some felt they could do better, and might have turned entrepreneur of sorts, and gone off to raid the British Isles, mainland Europe, the lands that would become Russia and Ukraine, and many more. While not having the motive to immediately settle, population rise did have some pressure on wealth and status back in Scandinavia, helping to give a reason for some people to go out and find means of wealth abroad. As the Viking Age reached the medieval warm period, and the population really grew, the prospect of land acquisition then became a real possible motive for the Viking conquests, but not at the outset. While population was a factor, it most likely was not the main motive for the start of the Viking Age. It has often been cited as the cause for the age, but this reasoning ignores elements that encouraged the expansion. In successive episodes, we will look at the internal and external political factors that encouraged the Vikings to leave their Scandinavian homelands and seek other pastures. the militaristic factors in the rest of Europe that left themselves open to raids and conquest, technology that allowed for the raids to happen en masse and empowered the Vikings and Scandinavian traders to reach faraway destinations, and finally the economic drives for the invasions that bolstered the need for goods and trade on an enormous scale and called for even more attacks. And that's the episode for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please click that like button to help bring this video to new viewers and subscribe for more content on Vikings and other history videos. Also consider supporting the channel on Patreon or by using the link provided for downloading the free web browser Brave for more privacy on your internet. Lastly, I would like to thank all my subscribers for continuing to support the channel, and a thank you to all those here for the first time. I'm Eric the LonePineWolfman, and remember, never stop learning.